There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am at the farm in Saskatchewan and with this very prairie backdrop. This is on the second floor of the house where I grew up. I lived here from about the age of 13, something like that. And this is the balcony off my parents' bedroom. And I think it's maybe the third time in my life I've ever stepped out here. There was an old chair. I think sometimes they sit out here and watch a sunset or a sunrise, but it's never been very much used. And I thought it would be the perfect backdrop for Friday Reads at the farm. I came out yesterday and I'll be here until Monday, and it's good to get back to some country living, which for me means put my feet up and be fed and watered and looked after. I'm exaggerating, but only about this much. It's lovely to be here. It's a cloudy day, but that's mostly smoke, we think. I can't smell any smoke. There's no forests or anything near us, but we've been getting it off and on all summer. Certainly, fire is in the news. North America is burning up, not just North America. The fire in Maui was just horrifying, and Canada now has very serious, well, our forests have been burning all summer long too. Eastern Canada, Western Canada, the Pacific coast. There's not many trees in Western Canada, so this is one of the safest places to be right now, although Mom and Dad did bring to my attention that there have been a lot of farm equipment fires and farmyard fires, far more than there ever used to be because it's so dry. So it's not like we are immune to the climate change related danger of fire. But it's not going to sweep the province because there's not trees or, well, I guess if it was at the right time of the year when just before harvest or something, it could sweep through crops and carry over a considerable distance, and that's scary. But the fact that this is prairie keeps us somewhat protected from what the rest of the continent is dealing with. But up in the Northwest Territories, the capital city of the Northwest Territories, I think it's a city of 50,000 people, has been ordered evacuated, and that's in progress, and that's scary. And there have been neighboring towns that have been completely destroyed by fire. And there is a city of several 100,000 in British Columbia, Kelowna, that is now being partially evacuated. As usual, I have nothing eloquent or profound to say about it. It's really scary. It feels like the new normal, and I hope I'm wrong, but it's certainly, if you listen to the experts, it's only going to get worse. I am at least somewhat cognizant of the fact that it is a ridiculous privilege I have to be sitting here talking about my reading while the world is burning around me. I don't think I have a whole bunch of personal news. I am feeling about the same, to be honest. I had a lovely visit with Lindsay. We were too busy getting caught up on personal news. We didn't make a tipsy book video, but we had a great time, and I could rouse myself to really visit with her from like 6 p.m. until midnight without, keep my chronic fatigue-like symptoms at bay. But I've gone back to just feeling, it feels like chronic fatigue. I don't think I have chronic fatigue. I don't think I'm that special to have such a newfangled thing, but it's just, it's what I said last week. Mildly headachy, muscle achy, and tired. So I just woke up from a mid-morning nap after teaching an hour on Zoom to some lovely students back in Japan at 7 a.m. And here I am. Aside from that, and aside from having a really great reading week, all things considered, I don't have any other news. Kenji's great, and had a great chat with him the other day, and he's already in love with Mom and Dad's new little dog, Charlie, and anxious to meet him, and we still no updates about when he's going to get here, but it shouldn't take any longer than until the end of the year for him to get here. So here's the week in review. Have either of you read the short story collection Jesus' I don't know how do you pronounce that, with Jesus apostrophe S. Is it pronounced Jesus' son or Jesus' son?
Jesus'
anyway,
son is what I'd say, but
Jesus' son. Anyway, so that one by Dennis Johnson. There's a similar wackiness to those stories that also has an undercurrent of emotional intensity and potency that I thought of it as I've been thinking about that collection as I've been reading. I've read the first 3 stories of this so far. Here it is. It's set in a poor working class steelworking community in Hamilton in the 70s. And it's pretty chunky. It is 425 pages. Here is the opening paragraph. Chapter 1, the setting is May 1977. "I can't believe they actually have goddamn basket weaving here," Ted said. The corners of his mouth slid into a half smile as he lit a cigarette and exhaled bluish smoke into the air with a sigh of pleasure, pushing a greasy strand of his shoulder-length hair behind his ear. I don't have a really sensitive nose, but I do on occasion put it right up into my nose like we were doing. Take a good whiff, and I enjoy that, but I do it very infrequently.
Yeah, it's definitely not like the first thing that attracts me to a book, right? I'm not, does it smell good? If it smells good, I think I'll pick it up.
This week I finished 4 books. Let me tell you about them, and we'll take it from there. I'll just show this for a minute. I finished that Russian novella, The Accompanist by Nina Berberova, and I didn't really like it. It's doubly translated. It was translated from the Russian to French by Marian Schwartz, and then from French to English by William Collins. Originally published in 1933 or something like that, in the 30s. Yeah, it was really well written, but I wasn't very interested in it. I was kind of bored by it because the theme is this lower class, down on her luck accompanist, pianist, gets hired by an illustrious opera singer who is rich and takes really good care of the protagonist, takes her under her wing, is really, really good to her. But the protagonist is uncontrollably resentful of the difference in station in life and the charity that she's accepting. She's getting paid for what she does, but she would never ever be adored by the masses in her own right the way this singer is. And so it's a tale of envy, and I just find envy and rivalry really boring themes in fiction. They don't interest me. I wasn't interested by this story, and I just found the protagonist so uninterestingly unlikable that I'm surprised that I finished it. It was so short enough that there was no point in not finishing it. The writing was good. It carried me to the end just to see, is there something? Is there going to be any other dimension of this protagonist's character that is going to be revealed, aside from the fact that she is guilty about being envious and can't stop plotting revenge? And by the end, I realized, no, there was no other dimension to her character, so it was a bit of a flop. 3 stars. Much more successfully, I finished After Sappho by Selby, Wynn, Schwartz. I pushed myself to finish it because the audiobook was due back with no possibility of renewal, and so I finished it this week. I had a really complicated relationship with the audiobook. I'll talk about that in a minute. This was a 5-star read for me, despite the problems I had, because really the major problem I had was with the audiobook. I'm not going to penalize the book for the things I struggled with the audio narration. This book was just exquisite, and often inaccessibly so, but I could access it and sink into it enough that there was no possibility of giving it anything other than 5 stars, even when it lost me. Because I think that the times, the pages, the chapters when I lost my connection to it were about brain fog or not having enough coffee or whatever. It wasn't the fault of the text. It's been a while since I've talked about this. Let me try to describe what it's like. It is a series of brief vignettes, and each vignette, or most of the vignettes, have a poetic quality or a quality that is beyond just the events that are being reported, the stories that are being told. There is, they tap into metaphors and they resonate with Sappho's fragments. Often the title of the vignette is a fragment of Sappho's, and the story that is spun is of an elite group of European and American lesbians, most of them writers, but also other cultural celebrities that explored within themselves and pushed their societies to test the boundaries of and create the identities of being a lesbian in the late 20th century up until just around World War II. And the central hum of this book is that Sappho's fragments. You don't need me to tell you that Sappho is kind of the mother of lesbianism and the mother of poetry. And Selby, Wynn, Schwartz makes the connection very early on. And I was able to keep this connection vibrant in my mind for 80% of what I read. That there was a vibration between those fragments that she uses as a central metaphor for the various lesbians, again, mostly across Europe, but also eventually into America. And many of whom fell in and out of bed with each other and made friendships and inspired each other. That there was this same vibration between their lives and the way they pushed their societies and challenged their societies, and in too many cases were persecuted by their own countries, the fascists and homophobes of their own cultures, and forged a continuity of lesbian identity and lesbian literature and lesbian art and music that vibrated for me as I read. But it's really weird. It isn't a straightforward telling of the lives of these characters. I Google read the heck out of this book, and I think if you don't do that and you're not steeped in lesbian history, you'd be a little lost. But there might be other readings of this, other ways to read it. But the way that I read it was to keep looking up these people, to keep my foot in the actual history as the narratives were woven together in such a poetic way. And I kept remembering Sappho's fragments. They all stood alone, but they all wove another poem together, and that's what she was up to here. And it mostly worked on a profound level for me, and there were times when I just couldn't, where it just was me reading a few excerpts and trying to pick up that rhythm and losing it for a few pages. But that was mostly a joyous reading experience. I did it as an audio text combo, but there were other times where I just put the book down and just listened, because I could just fall into the audio narration, as flawed as it was. The audio narrator had a stance towards the text that really worked for me. There was a kind of a nasal, ironic tone in her voice that satirized the stupid men that these women had to do with, while bringing their courage and creativity and mischievousness front and central. I don't know how to describe what I liked about the voice beyond that, but it really worked. Her voice, I don't know her name, really worked for me. Especially at the beginning, but throughout the text, there were a whole bunch of Italian lesbians that I'd never heard of. Lina Paletti and so many others, and I didn't know anything about them and was fascinated to read about them. And I think when I looked up who this audio narrator was, that she's Italian American or something. Her pronunciation of the Italian words, the book titles, the names of the historical terms, the names of the parliament or whatever, was perfect, I thought. I don't know. But there was also a lot of French in it. And as someone who pronounces French really poorly, the French pronunciation was abysmal. And so I kept getting pulled out of the story because she would massacre these names. And I did put the audiobook down for quite a few pages, and then I really missed that nasal, ironic tone, and so I just kind of held my nose over the French parts and then really enjoyed the rest of it. So I had a mixed experience with the audiobook, and it was a challenging read that I think if you don't like experimental fiction at all, and you're not able to viscerally hang on to the central image of the fragmentary power of Sappho's poetry, and view the stories that are spun here of the pioneering lesbians of Europe and North America, it wouldn't work for you at all, I don't think. I've heard very mixed reviews of it. I'm delighted that I had such a positive experience, and with those qualifications or whatever, I recommend it very highly. And I have finished True Biz by Sara Nović. I still haven't got that price tag, that sticker off. And it's a heavy book, so I think I'm actually going to cheat and put it down and just put up a cover gif. What a wonderful debut novel. What an incredible eye-opener about deaf experience and culture and history. Such a fabulously successful didactic novel. I don't think I've ever said that about a didactic novel before, but this was truly a rich, satisfying, literary didactic novel that taught me a lot. Not that I'm going to stop there. In fact, Heidi and I this was a buddy read with Heidi of My Reading Life, and we're going right on to read a nonfiction book about, that's kind of a memoir by a deaf writer. I'll tell you more about that next week. But just opened up so many political and personal and psychological dimensions to being deaf in a hearing world. It wasn't perfect. The writer Sara Nović tried to fit too many characters and maybe too many issues in, and so there was just a very few, I would say only 2 or 3, that got short shrift and where the character work suffered because the character was in the story really just to make a political point. But like I say, 2 or 3 little storylines or issues and very minor characters that didn't really need to be there or didn't get the full treatment they deserved. But then the 97% of it, it was just so richly explored with such a direct educational purpose. Like, this is what it's like. This is the history. This is how sign language works. Here's how you make these expressions with diagrams and so on. The main character is Charlie, and Charlie, when we meet her, is a high school student who got a cochlear implant when she was very young, and it never worked properly. And so she was stuck in a regular school and was only ever able to pick up, I forget what percentage was quoted, but something like 40% or 30% of what was going on around her in the classroom, because the cochlear implant was shitty. Now, I don't know anything more than what I've read in this book about that controversy, but apparently they might be better now or whatever. But she had a terrible, terrible time. And so by the time she gets to high school, her parents actually divorce over their disagreement over the cochlear implant. The mother's a big fan of it. The father has come around to realizing that they have cheated their daughter out of a education with sign language. She never learned it, and that they now need to get her into a deaf school to try to get caught up. And so they split up over it, and Charlie starts at the school, and it's really, she's the central character, and we see her through that first year of school, as well as many other characters, including the head mistress of the school, February, a hearing child of deaf parents, and she's like 40 or 50, and she's the head mistress, and she's very pro-deaf culture, deaf education. And she has a mother who has dementia and who she communicates with in sign language, and a whole bunch of other characters. I'm not going to say any more about it. I'm not going to try and say more about the book, just that it explored these issues in a way that usually I was on the edge of my seat because of the drama and the heightened, the more aware the story made me about all of the issues involved, the more that the plot line became almost, well, like I say, I was on the edge of my seat. It was a glorious novel. I am so glad that I read it. I'd vaguely heard of it, and then it was Emily of the Book Cookers that put it solidly on my radar when she talked about it in the Book Cookers Bite-Sized Book Chats episode. Heidi and I really just fell deeply into it. I recommend it very, very highly. Like I say, in a sense, it's a bit of a controversial book because it's partisan in that should the deaf person be integrated into the hearing world or encouraged to thrive in the deaf world. And so there's actually a phrase which I loved, deaf gain instead of hearing loss, but there you can see the cultural divide, and that is explored in a way that made it hard for me not to valorize the deaf cultural side of that partisan divide, but yet there was enough nuance and subjectivity where you could see that there was assholes and whatever on both sides or whatever. Still, it certainly made me deeply suspicious of, if not outright hostile to, the cochlear implant side of all of this. When I went to university in Saskatoon, right across the street was a school for the deaf, and a few years after I graduated and left, it closed. And I've been thinking about that school. I can't really find very much out about what happened to all of those students. Like, I guess they were all integrated into regular classrooms. Now, if they had the kind of experience that Charlie had, that strikes me as being a huge mistake and tragedy. But it's made me curious to find out and become more aware of how these issues are playing out around me. I had a deaf friend in my 20s and 30s who never learned to sign and only lip read. And so she was raised with that to integrate fully into the hearing world, and didn't have any deaf friends at all, and wouldn't have been able to communicate with them if they were communicated in sign language. So yeah, it's fascinating and important. But it was also just a really rich literary novel. I loved it. I recommend it very highly. It'd be a great book group book, because I think you'd probably have some really fascinating discussions. Certainly Heidi and I did. And I've also finished, in a manner of speaking, I finished Breast Stories by Mahasweta Devi, translated from the Hindi by Gayatri, Chakravorty, Spivak. Editing Sean here. I didn't ever explain what I meant by in a manner of speaking. Over half of this book is editorial commentary, prefaces and forwards and commentaries by the translator, Gayatri, Spivak, and I didn't read any of those. There was only 3 short stories in the collection. Did read all of those. And sad to say that it wasn't a complete success. The first story was Droppity, and that's one of the best short stories I've read all year. The second one, Breast Giver, was too on the nose, and the third story, Behind the Bodice, was quite a bit too much on the nose for my liking as well. Especially that middle story, Breast Giver. The plot and the characters were just there to make a political point. It's the kind of political fiction I dislike, whereas in the first story, much like what I've just tried to say about True Biz, that the story and the character work was deep enough that it wasn't just a political didactic story in the way that we usually use didactic. I use didactic to praise True Biz in the fact that it actually did teach me something, because it worked as a work of literary fiction. 2 of the 3 of these stories didn't. So I think that's all I'm going to say about it. Jo was a bit disappointed too. This was a buddy read with Jo Smith, because she's read other stories of hers, and only Droppity came up to the level of the stories she'd read before. So this is a weak collection. Certainly Gayatri Spivak was a gifted translator, but she's also a very, very, very political person. She translates in a way that the prose was a joy to read, certainly compared to Spivak's own theoretical, I'm going to say nonsense. I don't mean the content, I mean the prose is nonsensically abstruse. But she's also a very political person, to put it mildly. So it's always the gamble when you're going to read a politically inflected work of literary fiction. Is it going to communicate through character and story, or is it just going to bang you over the head with its politics? And the middle story, I think really all it did was bang the reader over the head. The third story was a bit more nuanced, but still neither of them compared to Droppity, which was just a richly satisfying work of short fiction that I will be thinking about for a long, long time. So I want to read the stuff that Jo has read to catch up to her, and keep reading Mahasweta Devi, because I'm fascinated by her, as I made clear when I first checked in on this book. But this collection was, in total, a little bit of a letdown. In terms of books that I've made progress with, that I'm far enough into to check in on, I'm only going to do 2. I'm going to check in on one that I'd hoped to finish for today, and I didn't, but I'll finish it within a day or 2. This Western Canadian novella, The True Story of Ida Johnson by Sharon Riis. I had read it. I'd been to the reading. It wasn't a book launch, but I'd been to a reading with the author at Edmonton in the late 80s, early 90s. And I read it after that, and I didn't remember much about it. I'm now at 70%. I am enjoying the writing very much, and the innovative structure of it is fascinating in the various points of view. Ida Johnson is a greasy spoon roadside diner waitress, and some young man who is very odd and kind of creepy buys her breakfast or whatever if she will tell him the story of her life. And then we get all these different points of view as she relates her life story. The only other thing I'm going to say about it is it's really rich in the writing and the point of view and the structure, but unless something happens in the final third or whatever, Ida Johnson, this young waitress, she is amoral. Maybe, what's that word? Sociopathic? I don't know if I'd use sociopath. I mean, whatever. But she has committed horrifying crimes and has no remorse. And it's not problematized in the text. Do I need it to be problematized in the text? Maybe not. But what I, as a reader, need is, well, so this just, I don't know how to finish that sentence. But this goes back to what I was saying about rivalry. It's on a different order of moral seriousness, I suppose. But characters who are just bad and there's no nuance, or I'm not allowed access to any layers to understand it or to feel for her regardless, leaves me cold. And so this is leaving me a bit cold because of the vicious acts of violence that she has committed, that she just kind of mentioned summarily, and I am not yet finding that in the text that there's anything else that the text is going to care to show me or give me a way into understanding it or whatever. So I'm feeling a little bit cold towards the book, despite all the other things that I'm really, really enjoying. I hope that there might be something that pulls me in deeper for the final third, but time will tell. I'm reading this in preparation for part 2 of my chat with the Calgary novelist Barb Howard about novellas. And I'm not that far into Marzahn, Mon Amour by Katja Oskamp, translated from the German by Joe Heinrich. But I'm far enough in, I'm so enthusiastic about it that even though I'm maybe 30 pages in, and it's a slim novella, that I'm just dying to tell you about it. This is so rich and lovely. I just love it. I'm really, really excited about it. It is about this German writer in Berlin who decides to quit writing because it ain't all it's cracked up to be, and she wants a change, so she becomes a chiropodist, which is like podiatry. I don't know if in Canada we use the word chiropody, but it's podiatry. So in Berlin, in the post-Berlin Wall era, but in the former East German part of Berlin, so East Berlin, she takes like a 2-week course or something with a whole bunch of other middle-aged women to become a chiropodist. And so she's not a doctor. She's more she's just like a technician or whatever, a medical, like she's got that amount of training, and maybe a little bit longer than 2 weeks, but not much more, if at all. And then she opens her own studio. And then each chapter is one of her clients. And they're all old East Berliners. And she brings them alive so tenderly and poignantly with such rich characterization in a 5-page chapter. It's beautiful. I love it so much. It's such a Sean book. Marzahn is the area of Berlin, and I've researched it a little bit to make sense of what I was reading. Those Soviet huge apartment complexes, I'll put a picture up on the screen, that are called in German Plattenbau, but they're prefab housing estates, and you've seen pictures of them anytime you've seen anything about Eastern Europe, and maybe not only. I mean, some of them looked like buildings I've seen in Toronto or whatever, but it's a little bit of a picture there on the cover, and that's her little clinic is on the main floor of one of these buildings, and all of her clients are coming from just around in the neighborhood. The portraits of these elderly people and their life story as they have shared them over time, and the relief, the balm that they receive from these regular monthly or whatever chiropody treatments, and the detailed depiction of what those treatments entail. which locates you right inside the elderly East Berliner character's body. Like, my feet were feeling better as I was reading it. I'm serious. Like, it was having that effect. Because it's like anyway, I'm not going to share any details about my feet, but I probably need to see a chiropodist. I looked Katja Oskamp up on Wikipedia this morning as I was reading a few more of the short chapters. And this mirrors her own life. She did give up writing and she did become a chiropodist. So then there's the irony built into the fact that then she wrote a novel based on her experiences. So it led her back to writing. And this has been the prize-winning, celebrated book of her career. She's in her, I forget how old she is. She's younger than me. But when you think about a writer giving up writing to go into kind of a seemingly lesser or lesser valued in a cultural sense job, like being a chiropodist, giving people foot baths and scraping dead skin off their feet, like what? That doesn't compute. Why would somebody do that? And then, as I'm reading the book, it's like the difference she's making in their lives and the way that she sees them and then shows them to me, the reader, it is incredibly beautiful. And I don't want to exaggerate the poignancy of it because it's not a feel-good, overly sentimental book. Not at all, but you just get taken right into the heart of these elderly characters' lives and into the heart of the protagonist and understand why she made the decision or what she's getting out of the experience herself. And it's just beautiful. Marzahn, mon amour, I will be shocked if by the end of this my opinion is anything other than more passionate than it is at this point. Brilliant and deeply, deeply moving. All right, so I finished 4, and this is maybe the first time, maybe this year, where I'm going to start fewer books than I finished. I'm going to start 1 fewer, 3 books. See, I'm chipping away, getting that number down. If you watch the video with Emily, you will find my number. I actually don't know what it is, but it's higher than what I ever said there. It's over 40 books now. This is one of the final books for Women in Translation Month, and I'm really excited to try it. This is a Tibetan novel, Flowers of Lhasa, by Tsering Yangkyi, translated from the Tibetan by Christopher Peacock. Can't wait. Joe Smith and I, we had a long list of potential buddy reads. We've made a late addition to the list, and we're going to go right to a book from 1945, Betty Miller's On the Side of the Angels, which I believe is I think Betty Miller was Irish. Yeah, she was born in County Cork to Jewish, Lithuanian, and Swedish parents. Lived most of her life in North London, marrying the psychiatrist Emanuel Miller. And her son is the apparently famous Sir Jonathan Miller, who I'd never heard of until, I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was. I had some guy who lives in Israel on my channel years ago, and he raved about Jonathan Miller. But Jonathan Miller has written the foreword, and I'm excited to get into this with Joe Smith. And it is time for the next, in chronological order, the next Edna O'Brien novel is my series of buddy reads with Sonia of An Enthusiastic Reader. This is A Pagan Place, published in 1970. Oh, it's set in Ireland, so I'm glad. The protagonist had joined a religious community in Belgium, and then from my little scan of the back, maybe she stays there and is just remembering her childhood in Ireland, but at least there's going to be more Irish content, which is what I value probably most highly in Edna O'Brien's writing. All right, well, that's my Farmyard Friday Reads. Thanks for watching.